Welcome to Pod Save America. I'm Jon Favreau.
I'm Jon Lovett.
I'm Tommy Vietor.
Let's get to the news. On Friday night, Atlanta police shot and killed 27-year-old Rayshard Brooks outside of a Wendy's parking lot where he had fallen asleep at the wheel of his car in the drive-thru line when the officers were called. He struggled as they tried to arrest him, grabbed one of the officers' taser, and was shot twice in the back as he ran away. Atlanta's police chief stepped down following the incident, and Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms is calling for the officer who shot Brooks to be fired. Guys, your reaction to the terrible news, and how do you think it affects the ongoing debate over how to fix the undeniably broken institution of policing in America? Lovett?
Yeah, I mean, look, what I took away from it, honestly, is even amidst this incredible national focus on police brutality, on excessive force, on racism in policing, that this situation could take place, that the police could escalate in this way, that this person could be shot twice in the back while running, that a person whose crime was falling asleep in a drive-thru could end in death, I think is a reminder that these protests were needed. It is a reminder that this is a systemic, deeply ingrained problem. And, the focus on these events is the reason why you saw action take place really quickly, where in the past it took days, weeks, months. Sometimes it never takes place for there to be accountability, for officers to be fired or officers to be charged. We saw in this case that there's a real understanding that in this moment it is unacceptable to not respond quickly, to not immediately address the concerns of protesters. Now, I don't think anybody believes that what's happened so far in Atlanta is enough in response, including the resignation of the police chief. But that it could happen amidst all these protests, I think, is a really sad statement about the state of policing.
Tommy?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's horrifying. I mean, it is like Lovett said, his offense was falling asleep, and you can watch on video as this escalates and escalates. And, I do think this underscores why a lot of activists believe that more training or internal police department changes just can't possibly be enough, because we're so clearly at a moment of maximum attention and concern about police brutality and police violence. And you would imagine, or at least I would, that mayors and police chiefs and others are advising police officers to be even more cautious than normal given the moment. And yet we watch this man clearly running away from the police be murdered in cold blood. And it speaks to the need for drastic systemic reform immediately.
There was no reason that kind of force was necessary to stop someone who was running away. You had his license plate right there. You identified who the person was. I mean, the fact that within the Atlanta Police Department, multiple officers were fired just a few weeks ago for tasing a couple in their car for no reason. So these officers knew that had happened in their own police department. They had clearly seen the protests, seen the incidences of police brutality all across the country, and still the instinct was to draw a weapon, a deadly weapon, and shoot a suspect. That tells you that there is something deeply wrong with the institution of policing in this country that needs systemic reform. Let's talk about the debate over reform that's happening in Congress right now. Over the weekend, Republicans ruled out two significant reforms that have been pushed by activists, Democrats, and even a few Republicans: a national use of force standard and an end to qualified immunity, which is something that currently protects officers from lawsuits to hold them accountable for using excessive force. Senator Tim Scott, who the Republicans put in charge of police reform, called ending qualified immunity, quote, a poison pill for this bill, and said, quote, I think it's really difficult to establish a codified in law standard for use of force. So without these reforms, without doing something about qualified immunity, national use of force standard, Democrats are left with, hopefully, a ban on chokeholds, a federal law against lynching, better training, and more transparent reporting of police misconduct. So what should Democrats do? I mean, do they have any leverage here, Tommy?
Yeah, I do think they have leverage. I mean, look, the sort of experts I've read suggest that you want to do three big things at the federal level. One is get rid of qualified immunity. One is get better data on the use of force by these police departments. And then, three, set some policy standards and better resource departments and cut off funding if those standards aren't met. And, I don't think this bill meets the moment. And the leverage, I believe, are that 82% of Americans want to ban police from using chokeholds. This is a recent Reuters poll. 92% want body cameras. 91% want to allow independent investigations of police departments that show patterns of misconduct. 75% want to allow people to sue for misconduct. So the American people are on the side of reform. This bill falls very far short. I mean, I struggle with this. Normally, I'm someone who thinks that progress is incremental and sometimes you need to pocket things. But I think I personally would rather wait until after the election where we might have the Senate. We hopefully will have a new president, pray to God. And so I don't know, this just feels like it's not even close to enough.
Lovett, what do you think? I mean, are these reforms worth a big White House signing ceremony where Republicans and Donald Trump can say they did something on police reform?
It's a good question. I also think one of the things I want to understand better is how much of what we're seeing is where we're heading in terms of a final bill, and how much of this is the kind of negotiation and back and forth, right? You've had Cory Booker saying that qualified immunity is on the table. Then you have Senator Tim Scott saying that it's off the table. You have Tim Scott making an argument that isn't against qualified immunity. It's that he wants to make sure something won't get vetoed, that something is possible. So at the same time, you've even seen, Republicans in the House come out in favor of a number of the pieces of the Democratic bill, while trying to decry the Democrats for writing a bill without them, which is pretty rich. So I actually don't know. I think it really depends on what actually comes out of Congress, and I don't totally understand yet if the fight over qualified immunity is truly over, or if it is still still being negotiated in some way.
Yeah, I mean, I think that no matter what happens, Democrats in Congress need to make clear that they are on the side of systemic reform, that they're not just about getting something done to get something done. I think the most important number that Tommy just mentioned in terms of that Reuters poll was the 75% of people who support allowing victims of police misconduct to sue police departments for damages. That would require changing qualified immunity. That's what's that about. So this reform that Republicans seem to be balking at is something that's supported by 75% of the American people, including 6 of 10 Republicans. So no, I'm the same way, Tommy. I usually think about we just, getting something done is important. We want progress, but it's very clear that Republicans have been scared by the protests politically, and they are dying to get something done before an election year to say that they did something. And I don't know if I'd give them that, because the momentum to do something on this, it's hard for me to see that we do something now on this, and then after the election we come back to this and pass extra reforms. I hope so. I trust that Joe Biden will do that. I hope that Joe Biden will do that. People should put pressure on him to do that. But it does seem like if they're going to just do Band-Aid solutions, I mean, some of these use of force policies, they've been adopted in cities all across the country. There's no reason to not have a national use of force standard. It's like the least that Congress can do from a federal level. Ending qualified immunity is the least that Congress can do on a federal level. A whole bunch of extra reporting and training stuff is just not going to do it this time around,
Yeah, I mean, the other one big number from that poll I should have mentioned was that 76% of the people who responded said they support moving some money that's currently going to police budgets into better officer training or local programs for homelessness, mental health assistance, and domestic violence. And those are really some of the big pieces that people are talking about when they talk about defund the police. It's sort of completely reimagining how we keep people safe in this country, including different kind of responders for mental health crises, better investments in schools and other domestic priorities versus policing communities or over-policing communities. So I do think we need to think about this in a big holistic way, and I do worry about checking the box, saying we did something, and then 5 years from now the same stuff is happening.
To Tommy's point, also, the polling is shifting so rapidly.
Yeah.
And I think that it is, if this is considered to be a moment where there's a consensus for action, there's a ton of attention, that consensus may fade or change. That would be the argument for doing whatever you can right now. But we're in the midst of an incredible flux in opinion. In that same poll, these incredibly popular positions are really, it's it's surprising to see how much of a consensus there is around some of these reforms. But even the more aggressively framed defund position, which is to completely dismantle police departments and give more financial support to address homelessness, mental health, and domestic violence, even that being at 39%, almost 40% of the country getting behind that aggressive a position tells you that something really historic is happening, something really big is happening. And it argues for not just getting this done quickly, but making sure that as this momentum builds, you end up with a really significant piece of legislation.
I will say something else on this that's different. When we were debating immigration reform and some activists were talking about abolishing ICE, those reforms to immigration largely happen on a federal level. You can have sanctuary city laws, of course, in localities, but mainly big changes have to happen on a federal level. They have to have Congress and they have to have a president. With police reform, especially for some of these calls to reimagine public safety, change the funding in police departments, that can happen at a local level. So absent action in Congress right now, because we're waiting for more systemic reform and we need an election where we have more Democrats in power, activists can make a big difference on a local level. Over the weekend in San Francisco, Mayor London Breed announced that San Francisco will try replacing police officers with trained, unarmed professionals to respond to calls about non-criminal matters involving mental health, the homeless, school discipline, and neighbor disputes. Of course, we talked about, Minneapolis City Council voting to eventually disband that police department as well. So this is an issue where you can see a lot of change on the local level, absent what's happening in Washington, D.C., which is hopeful.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's talk about Trump, who's handling all of this with his usual deft touch. On Thursday, we talked about how he planned to hold a huge MAGA rally in Tulsa, the site of one of the worst race massacres in history, and decided to do it on Juneteenth, the holiday that commemorates the end of slavery in America. As an encore, Trump sat down on Friday with Harris Faulkner of Fox News, who I'm pretty sure is the only black woman he's done a full interview with as president, and he said the following.
I think I've done more for the black community than any other president, and let's take a pass on Abraham Lincoln because he did good, although it's always questionable. In other words, the end result.
Well, we are free, Mr. President.
But we
you
are
did
free.
pretty well.
You understand what I mean.
Yeah, no,
so I'm going to take a pass on Abe.
And on police reforms, he said this.
I think the concept of chokehold sounds so innocent, so perfect, and then you realize if it's a one-on-one, now if it's two-on-one, that's a little bit of a different story, depending on the toughness and strength. We're talking about toughness and strength. We are talking, there's a physical thing here also.
So after the very predictable uproar that ensued to all of these statements and announcements, Trump tweeted on Friday night that, quote, after hearing from many of my African-American friends and supporters, he'd be moving the date of the rally to the day after Juneteenth out of, quote, respect for this holiday. Not sure that fixes all of the other racist buffoonery over the past several days, but Tommy, why do you think he did it? Why do you think he moved the rally?
So Senator Tim Scott, who is we were talking about earlier, is the only African-American Republican in the Senate, said that President Trump was unfamiliar with the significance of that date of Juneteenth, June 19th. It is inexcusable if that is true, but frankly, it wouldn't surprise me if Trump personally was unaware of the significance. But his staff must have been, right? And members of his staff also undoubtedly know that Tulsa was the site of horrific white-on-black violence and terrorism in 1921 that led to at least 300 people being murdered, African Americans, the destruction of thousands of black-owned businesses and homes, and the forced internment of these families. And so I think that his staff scheduled this event on purpose, right? He does not need votes in Oklahoma. That's not what this is about. This is giving the finger to people who care about social justice and decency. And that is what the modern Republican Party is about. It's about trolling and intentionally hurting people they dismiss as social justice warriors, And so I'm glad he moved the event. He tried initially to say it was a celebration of Juneteenth, which is as stupid a thing as you can say. But, I think there's a direct line between this event and the date of it, and then announcing a bunch of policies we'll talk about later that attack LGBT people at the beginning of Pride Month. I think that's all on purpose.
So apparently this morning, Jonathan Lemire of the Associated Press said that the staff did know that it was on Juneteenth, and they did know the significance of the holiday, but they weren't prepared for the blowback, is what he said. which is ridiculous. Lovett, what did you think about him making the decision to move it? Because, like Tommy just said, he did say, well, it's a celebration of Juneteenth, and then he walked it back, which is rare to have a Trump walk back.
Yeah, it's always strange when normal politics works on Trump. That his staff thought they could get away with the dog whistle of going to Tulsa on this day, when, as Tommy points out, everyone would be like, why are you going to Oklahoma? It is not a swing state. They thought they could maybe send that signal without it leading to an uproar, but that, of course, is not what happened. There is a long tradition of this in Republican politics, with Reagan giving a speech outside Philadelphia, Mississippi, around states' rights to send a signal to his racist Southern supporters. So now, as to why he moved it, maybe like so many others, the Trump administration and Trump's campaign team has been caught off guard by the scale of these protests and the tenor of this moment, surprised by how much attention has come down on him over going to Tulsa, but also, even though we'll talk about it, but the difficult position he's now put in between wanting to go back to his comfort zone of lashing out at protesters, lashing out at the Black Lives Matter movement, and where the country is right now, which is a broad-based consensus around reform.
Yeah, I mean, as Tommy just noted, they're sort of having this internal debate on a whole number of issues within the Trump campaign. Should you be like true MAGA, or should you try to expand your coalition, because that's usually how you win an election? On the anniversary of the Pulse nightclub shooting, Trump's Department of Health and Human Services finalized a rule to remove protections that would have stopped healthcare providers from discriminating against transgender Americans. And then you've got Ivanka tweeting about pride and everything. So this is clearly a divide that is within the administration. There's an NBC story from Friday about this internal debate. Basically, there's a debate over just how much racism will help the president win re-election. NBC has 3 sources that heard Trump dismiss the people in the streets protesting racism and police violence by saying, quote, "These aren't my voters." And while one of his advisors said, quote, he should be leading on police reform because he doesn't have any room to write off sets of potential voters, another said, we're losing the culture war because we're so scared to be called racist, and that Trump should be taking on the Black Lives Matter movement by calling it, quote, a front organization for a lot of crazy leftist ideas that are unpopular. What do you think? Is Trump losing because he hasn't been racist enough, Tommy?
I mean, I guess let me just step back. Like, no one should be surprised by a Republican presidential candidate using racism as a strategy, right? Barry Goldwater, Richard Nixon, they created and adopted the Southern strategy, where they courted Southern white voters who had been Democrats by stoking racial fears. Nixon went on to use euphemisms like silent majority or law and order to code his racial appeals. But even his entire war on drugs was an effort to go after the anti-war movement and the black community. I mean, his former top domestic policy staffer, John Ehrlichman, said that on the record, that they criminalized drugs to target and vilify black leaders. Ronald Reagan supported housing discrimination when he ran for governor in 1966. One of his first events in 1980 was a speech about states' rights in Mississippi, which everyone interpreted as an attack on civil rights legislation. So we could go on and on here. This is in many ways a continuation of strategies we've seen from Republicans for a very long time. While he did walk back this event, he also, Trump quickly came out in favor of keeping Confederate monuments and keeping military bases named after Confederate generals, even after basically the entire military said they should be talking about getting rid of them. So, look, his base, when they talk about his base, that is code for almost exclusively white people in this country. And so, of course, that is who he thinks about in every move he makes as president, because everything he does as president is about getting reelected.
Lovett, on the politics of this, it seems, at least so far, that this strategy of only playing to the base is not working in any way. And, who knows what the future may hold, but it's been a couple weeks now. We're past sort of like the snap polls that were occurring in the immediate aftermath of the protests, and he is still sort of losing by a larger margin and has a worse approval rating than he has in a couple of years.
Yeah, no, it's when he says those aren't my voters, he's right. That's true. the people out on the streets are not his voters. They will not vote for him. They will not support him. That's absolutely right. I think the struggle here, and you see him kind of whenever there is kind of dissensus inside of the Trump, I don't know, what would you call it? Evil clockworks. Whenever inside of this machine, there's things, the gears aren't clusterfuck, whatever you want to call it. They just do everything, right? So he's cautiously trying to figure out what he can support in terms of reform from Congress. He's still tweeting that, this protest movement wants to abolish the police. How crazy, right? They're trying both things at once. But what I think is interesting to me is the original way Trump becomes president, which is about inflaming and exciting his core base around some of these racial issues, around some of these cultural issues, while appealing to enough people who are not animated by that, maybe even turned off by that, but yet still are willing to kind of reluctantly pull a lever for him based on a bunch of other things, based on overlooking racism, what have you, that coalition may be changing, right? That actually, that appeal may still work for the base, but it's alienating enough people who have now had enough time with Donald Trump to see what it's actually like, and they don't care for it. That basic way of campaigning doesn't work, and he doesn't have a lot of other arrows in his quiver. He doesn't have a lot of other tools because he can't do empathy. He can't do unity. He can't do any of the things a normal president might do. I mean, there was this talk about him giving a race speech. Does anyone actually think that race speech would have been aimed at anyone other than white people, especially his white base? I don't. Of course not. Right. So he's sort of limited, and they're dealing with this limited person, and I don't think they're totally sure what to do.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me that it's a pretty fundamental misreading of the broader electorate. You're right, Lovett, that he looks at the protesters in the streets and says, these aren't my voters, and yes, those aren't his voters, and then you're talking about his base. There's a lot of other voters in the country besides his base and people who are on the streets, particularly people who have sort of made a big difference in the elections since Trump has become president, which are people who live in the suburbs. And I think the suburbs have changed. Their political views have changed over the last several decades, even more so in the last couple of years. And when you look at some of these polls, when you look at some of the support for police reform, support for the Black Lives Matter movement, support for the protesters in the streets, we're talking 60, 70, 80%, right? We're not talking 51, 52. You look at how Joe Biden is doing among suburbanites in places like Wisconsin, winning suburban women by 20, 30 points. Now, this might change, but Yasha Monk from The Atlantic was tweeting last week that he sat in a focus group of 2016 Trump voters who were undecided. And he said that more than the pandemic, more than the economic crisis, what they most didn't like about Trump was his divisiveness over the last couple of weeks, how he has inflamed the divisions in this country, how he has poured gasoline on the fire of what's happening in this country. And I think what the Trump people don't quite get is if they want to get a majority, not a majority of the popular vote, but even a majority in the states that add up to 270, they're going to need to get a lot of suburban voters who do not like this style. That Trump is, and it reminds me of what happened sort of at the end of the 2018 midterms when we were all very worried about his fears about MS-13 and the caravan and immigration, and in a lot of very key states and key districts, it turned people off of Trump.
I mean, look, this is what happens when your campaign team brings you a bunch of polls showing you getting creamed, and you throw them out of the office and commission a new poll that is more to your liking, right? I mean, he's not living in political reality. And look, I feel very burned like everybody else did by the, 2016 predictions made by myself included in this. But there's a large volume of data that shows that Trump is really struggling in this moment because of the divisiveness that we've always known even Trump supporters don't like. They don't like the tweets. They don't like the misogyny. They don't like the overt racism. It bothers them. It makes them embarrassed to support him. And that has been supercharged this last month, basically.
Yeah, and that, of course, is the difference between the Trump fans, the people that are going to show up at the Tulsa rally. They love all that shit. Yeah. But a lot of people who may have cast a ballot for Trump or didn't cast a ballot at all and are thinking about voting this time, it's much different. And again, this is where we are right now. 5 months to go. Who the hell knows?
Right. I think it's just worth pointing out, this may well be the the conditions of this race till Election Day. This also may be a nadir for Trump, and the conversation moves on, and we have a short memory. I mean, there were incredible low moments for Trump in 2016 in which all of this was part of the conversation, but our ability to forget how awful Trump is pretty, it's pretty strong. And so we just have to remember that, I think, that this could be a nadir, and it could get better for him.
So Trump was somehow able to avoid overt racism during his West Point commencement address over the weekend, but he did have a few other issues. At one point, he had trouble lifting his right arm to take a sip of water and had to use his left hand to push the glass all the way up to his mouth. And then after the speech was over, Trump looked like he was struggling to walk down the ramp after the speech. So videos of these moments went viral, and I wasn't even gonna maybe talk about them until Trump decided to tweet about this on Saturday night. He tweeted, quote, "The ramp that I descended after my West Point commencement was very long and steep, had no handrail, and most importantly, was very slippery. The last thing I was going to do is fall, in quotations, for the fake news to have fun with. Final 10 feet, I ran down to level ground. Momentum!" Momentum is my favorite part. So the ramp wasn't steep, slippery, or something that he ran down in any way. But what do you guys make of this? Like, I did enjoy the New York Times headline, "Trump's halting walk down ramp raises new health questions."
It was such a surprising thing to see a story like that about a Republican in the Times.
Yeah.
Raising questions is what we do about Democrats. But Tommy, I don't have anything insightful to say.
No, look, I mean, I don't know what to make of those videos. I am deeply uncomfortable with the idea of diagnosing people from afar. I think that a lot of people, including many on the left, disgraced themselves when they asserted that Joe Biden had some sort of cognitive issue based on heavily edited videos in an attempt to influence the primary when it was still going. That said, the health and wellness of candidates is a very legitimate discussion. And Trump has refused to meet the basic standards that we've required of past presidents when it comes to transparency around his health. So first it was, everyone remembers our buddy Dr. Harold Bornstein, right, who later admitted that the letter he released about Trump's fitness was dictated to him by the now president. Then there was this mysterious unannounced visit Trump took to Walter Reed last year, which has never been explained. It's also relevant in terms of the coronavirus and the continued peddling of hydroxychloroquine, even when Trump says he took it himself, but today the FDA said the drug is no longer authorized for use in treating COVID, and he's out there saying, like, there's something wrong with Joe Biden, right? So this White House will lie about literally anything. They drew on weather maps. I don't know how to interpret it, but what we do know politically is that this shit gets in his head real fast. Like the Lincoln Project, and some other anti-Trump groups are going hard at his insecurities. They're calling him weak. They're calling him frail. They're calling him unhealthy. And it is leading him to lash out and respond in ways that are unhelpful to his own campaign. You know, there was a report that Trump's campaign spent $400,000 on TV ads in D.C. because they felt like they needed to show the boss that they were responding to the Lincoln Project. So that is, you might as well light that money on fire. There's no voters in D.C., if that wasn't clear to folks listening. So it's in his head in a big way. I don't know what to make of it. It was weird.
Yeah, I mean, like, call me bewildered about what it all means and what was going on there. But the point is...
You're bewildered.
I'm bewildered. The point is, on Saturday night, as this country is in the midst of a pandemic that is still raging through the country, an economic recession, the likes of which we haven't seen since the Depression, and a moment of racial and social upheaval that we haven't seen in decades, the president's tweeting about his fucking trip down a ramp and complaining about it. That's the president. And we know that what really bothers people about him is that he is ineffective, that he cannot seem to solve any of the problems we're facing because he's more focused on himself than he is focused on the American people. And this fits right into that frame perfectly, because he just gets so upset about this bullshit. And as you mentioned, Tommy, like, they have previewed, they have said to reporters, Trump has said it, Kellyanne Conway has said it, that a big part of their strategy in defining Joe Biden is that he is, there's something wrong with him, that he's too old, that he's, and if they're going to do that, if they're going to make inferences about Joe Biden's health and well-being, then Of course this is fair game. And of course Democrats are justified in running those videos as much as they want. If he's going to do this about Biden, yeah, absolutely.
I also just think, like, I see people making fun of them. I'm glad people are making fun of Trump whenever it happens, generally. There are ads that are getting under his skin, great. But, like, as Trump is a mortal threat, you know, he is a dangerous demagogue. He is a racist. He is horrible on all these axes that are so much more important and so much more salient to me than this. That's all.
Yeah. Yeah. But throw everything at him you got.
Yeah,
so,
for sure.
so one last note about the West Point speech. You may remember that Trump basically forced the graduates to come back to campus for the speech after they had been sent home months earlier because of COVID, which meant that to be at the speech, they had to be in quarantine for 2 weeks just so Trump could get his photo op for this speech. He's also decided to hold this Saturday's possibly 20,000 person Tulsa rally indoors with no social distancing requirements, no mask requirements, though attendees will now receive apparently a mask, some hand sanitizer, and they will be required to sign a liability waiver where you agree to not sue the Trump campaign if you get COVID. So Trump seems to have forgotten about the virus, but the virus has not forgotten about us. Cases are now climbing in 22 states, and even though some of that is due to more testing, a few states are now seeing a record number of hospitalizations, including Texas, Arizona, Arkansas, North and South Carolina. How much of this is Trump's fault, Tommy, and how much is people and local officials, you know, who just refuse to deal with lockdowns anymore?
You know, look, the answer is probably unknowable. I mean, certainly they botched the response from the very beginning, and everything that has come after is associated with that botched early response, the lack of testing, the lack of, modeling good behavior. So all of that started on day one. I do think that Trump has expedited the push to reopen states. He refuses to wear a mask in a mask factory. That's not a great way to model basic personal behaviors that might actually help us do better. I mean, I do think there are some states that had lockdown that are still struggling. So I'm not sure, but holding a rally indoors when the health commissioner in Tulsa asked you not to is an insane escalation of that irresponsible behavior that could lead to a bunch of people getting killed. So I think people will be closely watching the fallout from that event, if any, right? Because for all the concern about protests, and there's this legitimate concern, I read today that we've seen at least 30 cases linked to protests, which actually seems to be pretty low given the scale of these protests, but maybe better data will come out at some point.
Lovett, what did you think?
Yeah, I mean, look, having been at a number of these protests now, the vast majority of people are wearing masks and they're outside. And that makes it a wholly different thing than being, and that doesn't mean that there's no risk. And I think that people denying that risk are being kind of defensive. But it's a wholly different thing than a massive indoor rally where people are potentially not wearing masks. You know, there's this debate about how culpable Trump is. Would Hillary Clinton have done better? I'm not particularly interested in it. How late was Trump? How much faster should he have gotten to this? Well, here we are now. It is June. We were supposed to go into stay at home so that the government would have time to build a proper national response. Didn't happen. There's still not enough masks. We still don't have enough testing. We still don't have a proper plan for making sure that we can reopen while socially distancing and remaining safe. And what's missing is that basic leadership from a president saying, hey, everybody, wear masks, especially because one of the things we've learned from experts in recent weeks is just how important masks can be. It is one of the most important things we have learned. That actually may be one of the mistakes we made early on was not pushing masks hard enough. And that masks themselves may allow us to have some amount of reopening and some amount of safety while being able to go back to our lives. Maybe certainly not fully, not as much as before, not in restaurants close to one another. And so if the fact that Donald Trump can't just say to everybody, hey, wear a mask, which would certainly save lives, save thousands of lives perhaps, save billions, trillions for the economy, we have no idea. The fact that he won't do that when it is fucking free is outrageous. It's outrageous.
It's outrageous. And here's the thing.
Murderous.
I do not think you can lay at Trump's feet the mixed messages on masks that we had at the beginning of this pandemic. I think And I don't even public health officials and epidemiologists didn't really know enough about the virus at first. And so we've learned more over time, right? But, when you talked about the what if Hillary Clinton was president? Okay, what if anyone else was president, right? We now have studies, multiple studies, not just one, multiple studies that say even if 50% of the population wore masks in public, it could significantly reduce the spread of the virus by up to 80%. It would get it below R1, which means the virus eventually dies out. When you look to multiple Asian countries, Japan, Taiwan, there's a whole bunch of countries where people wear masks because they've had other pandemics like this that were respiratory diseases, and they wore masks, and so it's more of a tradition there. And they have done so much better than us in tamping down this virus. It's not just about if Trump wore a mask. I have imagined for a while if Obama had been president during this, not only would he wear a mask, we would have this entire public education campaign. We'd get celebrities to wear masks, artists, entertainers, media people, influential people all across the country, because we would make it a cultural norm. And if you could do that, you could open up the economy, right? I understand people saying we can't be locked down forever, we can't keep the economy closed forever. I get that, right? But I don't understand people not being willing to fucking put a piece of cloth over your face.
Yeah,
and
look,
this idea, go ahead, Tommy.
I mean, daily numbers of cases are climbing on a daily basis in 22 states right now. And as far as I can tell, the coronavirus task force is no longer meeting. They have given up on having a federal response to this pandemic. All of it has been pushed upon states or just individual citizens, and that's with 115,000 Americans dead. So, yeah, it is just priced into the equation that they have completely given up. He is betting and hoping that he can just bullshit his way through this like he's done everything else in life. Fake it till you make it. And then, look, if things are really bad in the fall, he's probably thinking, well, I'm going to lose anyway, so I might as well predict that they're going to be better. And then if I guess right, I can tell all these, lefty liberals that they were wrong. It's an insane political strategy. There's so much more you could be doing that seems pretty basic, that would improve the economy, that would mean fewer people died. He just refuses to do it. They want to move on. It is unfathomable that this is where we are, but that's what he chose.
And like you said, it's not just he's his actions are going to lead to more infections and more deaths, which is, the thing we should be most concerned about is awful. Even from a pure political standpoint for him, right? The economy would be better if everyone wore masks, right? Because more people go back to work. Fewer people would die. That's better for him, even politically. And there is no substitute for national leadership on this, right? We're in Los Angeles. Our public health director, Barbara Ferrer, and Eric Garcetti, our mayor, tell us every day in press conferences to wear masks everywhere. There's a requirement. They're local officials. Who pays attention to that, right? People pay attention to, they turn on the news, they see the president, they see national figures. It should be a national effort in this country to get everyone to wear masks. You cannot do it on a local level. You just can't.
I also, I think one of the things that I have just sort of really internalized just during these protests is the real connection between the callousness with which police departments, with our culture, has treated whole swaths of the country. Black people, people in our cities, people, brown people, immigrants, what have you, and the callousness that Trump is using to respond to this crisis. It is the fact that there has been a right-wing propaganda outfit that has such disdain for its viewers and such disdain for the people who aren't watching, that can dismiss whole swaths of the country, just dehumanize whole swaths of the country. It is not that big of a leap from that kind of disregard for lives, for safety, for human beings, to disregarding the lives and safety of your own people, of your own supporters, to simply give up on caring about anybody. And so as we sort of, as we try to take on Trump, it is worth looking at just how quickly the Fox News mentality metastasized into not even caring about their own supporters, their own people who will show up, sign away their release. These are not healthy people. A lot of them showing up at these Trump rallies.
And these Fox personalities you're talking about, guess what they're doing? They're working from home.
Yeah, they're recording from home.
People who are super rich, they have access to testing. They're fine. They're going to stay indoors, or they're going to go outside and they're going to do, it's just, you're right. They have no regard for the people that they claim to be their people. None. They only have regard for themselves. We have a brand new podcast at Crooked Media. It's called Unholier Than Thou. Award-winning journalist and editor Philip Picardi is on a quest to better understand his relationship with spirituality by learning how faith plays a role in other people's lives. First episode, conversation about miracles with Dr. Darian Sutton, an ER doctor who's been on the front lines of the pandemic, also Phil's fiance. The second episode is a conversation with the rector of St. John's Episcopal Church, who was there when Trump staged his photo op the other week. Guys, it's an outstanding podcast.
It
It's
really
great.
is.
I love it. You'll really, really enjoy this. It is different. It is moving. Phil is an outstanding interviewer. It's really, really great. Subscribe to Unholier Than Thou on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. Finally, it's not too late to adopt a swing state. It is not too late. We have already had 2 digital organizing trainings with about 15,000, 16,000 people each, but we have a few more coming up. If you want to join, sign up to Adopt a State at votesaveamerica.com/adopt. We'll send you all the details you need. The next training is Thursday at 5 p.m. It's about vote by mail and special guest, Jon Lovett.
Neither sleet nor hail shall keep me. It's a male joke. I'm so sorry.
Yeah, no, I think you nailed it.
I'm really
You
sorry,
stuck the
everybody.
landing.
I'm really sorry.